What? Pokemon's popular again? I better jump on that bandwagon. I'm not too late, am I? I really want to show you some cool stuff about the animated sort of reboot series Pokemon Origins. Good hello and welcome to Read Between the Frames. Yes, Pokemon Origins retells the story of the original games Red and Blue, and much more accurately than the one we grew up with. It's 4 episodes long, definitely worth your time, and of course I'm gonna be spoiling some pretty major moments. The first thing I'd like to talk about is how well this show manages its budget. Throughout a large chunk of the episode, if nothing terribly interesting happening visually, just characters standing around having a bit of a chat to one another, there is no need to waste all of your money giving it unnecessary detail. So look at this, all the characters, there are only 2-tone shading and the movement there is still movement, but it's not a whole lot, and the shading is minimal. 2 tones maximum, and is always just sort of dabbled in around the edges or within the nooks and crannies of the character. By doing this kind of rim shading, it's very easy to pass on to a team, just say give it some rim shading, and you're gonna get one of 2 results, where it's lit from the front or lit from the back. But then suddenly a fight scene begins. Did you see that? So we are going to be taking a look at just one scene. This is my personal favorite battle across the entire franchise. So let's see how it's paced and how it's built up in a visual way when we slow it down to a frame-by-frame level. This scene is of course the climactic battle between Charizard and Blastoise. So through these opening shots you can see what I described before. Shading around the edges within creases of clothing, but nothing too much. A minimal amount so that you can still add a bit more movement without running out of time. Footsteps, simple gestures, but still something visually interesting. However, now things are starting to build up. Intensity is increasing, and what you can do is think about the music in most epic movies. Leading up to a climactic battle, everything increases. The tone, the pacing, the pitch, it will all build up and up before the actual battle has commenced. So have a look through these shots and see how that same thought process is actually put in a visual way through a whole variety of techniques. Notice the pacing of the shots, the camera angles, the increase of detail in the character's shading. Watch these sequence of shots very closely. Suddenly, for just this shot, we're bumped up to 3 tones of shading, and it's all very deliberately placed. The 3rd tone, more or less, is filling the role of what the 2nd tone did before. The nooks and crannies within certain areas of depth, or simply where there needs to be shading, but shading has already been placed there. The secondary tone, the mid-tone, that is the primary source right now. That's what's taking up the center frame, whereas what was the primary tone is now a highlight and is very deliberately angled coming from the right as the character moves towards the right, which is where the light is in the center of the room, building everything up further. So now, subconsciously, we have been introduced to this level of shading before the actual action has begun. This is quite important for a show like this, where the visual style of the non-action scenes compared to the high-action scenes can be so dramatically vast that it almost appears as 2 completely separate types of show. Ease an audience across these 2 visual types. But it isn't just high-level shading. The very next shot shows crazy camera moves, and this is a very interesting thing to note. When you start going through a shot like this, watch closely what's happening. Can you see the background is moving every frame, but the drawing of the main character is only moving on every 2nd frame. It's somewhat jarring when you look at it this pace, but when it plays normally, it appears just fine. So typically a frame rate for a show like this will be at 24 or 25 frames per second. Let's say it's 24 just because it's easier to think about and is more easily divisible. Because consider, having 24 individual drawings in order to get a single second worth of footage would be madness.
The cartoon's finished, Ren. Would you like to see it?
Solution: have a new drawing every 2nd frame. This is called animating in 2s or doubles. It provides a healthy mid-ground where you can increase or decrease the frame rate at your leisure. Sometimes the movement will be so intense and so fast you need to move into 1s or singles, have a new drawing every frame for a brief period, or sometimes where it may be so slow and unimportant that you can slow it down even further. A great deal of animes will spend the majority of their time at 8 or even 6 drawings per second. So considering that many gamers now take 60 frames per second for granted. Oh boy. But then comes a shot like this. That was smooth. The sequence is divided up into a few segments. For the first portion, as the camera pans up, notice how dramatically quickly the background is moving compared to the body. The character is indeed on 2s while the background is in 1s, until we reach approximately this point, where now we're seeing so much of the background, including the great big bright light in the middle. We're also angled up and twisting around the subject matter. For this reason, and also because we're building up to a very dramatic scene, and this itself is a very dramatic moment, this twist happening right now, you can see the background is indeed keeping up with the character. It is all in 1s, a huge amount of drawings for a very short amount of animation. It's not until we get all the way into this point that it once again becomes 2s. So now watching it again, we can appreciate its fluidity. It's easing us into and building us up for what the animation is going to be like during the fight scene before it even begins. Okay, here we go. First attack. It's so good. Alright, so this is a 4-step movement, at least. First of all, a lot of power is obtained through the anticipation of movement. The body slowly moving down and then very suddenly taking off. This whole movement is in 2s, and there is 10 drawings all moving down just for this descending movement. And then suddenly look how dramatically different this one is to this one. These two, hardly anything. And now with only a single in-between here, he's now moving off into the distance. And these 3 drawings are quite significant. There's about 5 or so images on the ending sequence, and there's, the whole bunch at the start. This is the only real in-between here. This one's another keyframe as it transitions from the anticipation into the push off. This is the only one that is actually him pushing off the ground. It has a lot of detail, smoke effects start to come in, and on the very next image, pretty much all of the third tone shading is now gone, save for just a couple of bits in the yellow under his belly, because there's no room for a highlight here. Now comes powering up the punch itself. It looks like one smooth movement, but is actually 2 separate shots. First, watch as the detail increases as he comes in closer. The detail of this shading shows off a lot of form compared to other areas of this episode where it's just for the sake of having a bit of tone. This is making the character have depth and form. At this point, we start getting some more line thickness variation as he moves past the camera and transitions into the next shot. Take note of these 3 frames here. It's simply a whole mass of orange. 2 thick black lines jut through the middle of the frame, being more horizontal, more diagonal, more vertical. Over just 3 frames, these are all in singles as well. That is enough information to the audience that he has now changed direction in a very smooth way. Through the height of his flip, the second tone shading is in relation to the light from above. Look how it reorientates itself as he starts to descend back towards the camera again. The anticipation for his punch begins here. There's 3 images of him clenching his fist before the glows start to begin. Again, watch the detail of the face evolve as it comes closer to the camera. And through the way the images are posed, our eye is led from Charizard's face up to his fist. Having a build-up this good with this much anticipation and this many movements, the actual impact itself didn't need to be drawn. Notice, the very first frame is already making impact, and the first several frames of this shot is all one drawing. It's simply a camera quake movement out. The characters stay perfectly still. It's all effects work here. And is at around this point that the characters have subtle movement, mainly Charizard's tail. Everything with the impact is shown through the effects. And man, it's good. Initiating the light and the fire from his head, and then moving into a shockwave of smoke from his feet. And are you ready now? The next shot is my favorite still image in the entire franchise. Oh man, he's so angry. Look at him, you can see the rage, the intensity. You just know that Charizard's about to get messed up. I love how much line thickness variation there is around his arm, around the middle of the face, in his eyes. All of the small lines that kind of crinkle around his cheek. It's just so crazy. But it gets even better, and it's so subtle, and there's only about 4 drawings, and they are so ridiculously similar. But the change is enough that you just know that Charizard is in for a bad, bad time. You ready? There. Look at that. That's the difference we're looking at. It's hardly anything. The final 2 drawovers appear to be almost a direct traceover. The only difference in shift is because of the camera movement. The lines have such a subtle wobble, but boy does it work. This shot incorporates several of the techniques we've seen so far. It has thick lines on the close-ups, it has slow anticipation before a sudden impact. The pacing's so good, it just makes the impact so much more just... This time it even has these little dash speed lines it's moving so quickly. And even then, see the background moving there? It's still in 2s. We move past his face with only 3 frames, and 3 more frames focus in on the cannon, before suddenly the burst, this amount of movement between 2 images. That's nuts! And then look at the camera quake, it's so... oh man. And then when this cannon's ready to blow, it does the opposite. It zooms in suddenly, and we get a gradual move out over several drawings. And the pace of that camera out movement transitions quite smoothly into this one that moves back in. And goodness me, there's a lot of zoom into eye movements in this. Here's an interesting one. Look how thick the lines are. That's not because of any kind of deliberate action. It's simply because we are zoomed in on a wide shot. And it's approximately 18 frames or 9 drawings of this slow movement to get out to this point, before suddenly, bam, once again, very dramatic change to make the impact, the general oomph of it, all the more satisfying. And the pace of this smoke cloud moving out is quite a soft, slow one, before filling up the screen and a second wash of smoke comes over. And the handy trick about this is twofold. One, it makes it seem all the more crazy, and second, it's faster to do because you literally don't have to worry about in-betweening it all. Every frame is just new shapes. Charizard! The struggle up is really interesting. To start, it has the same trace over that the close-up Blastoise face did. The same drawing traced over again to give it that tremor, that emotion. And as he slowly climbs to his feet, it's snapping back and forth over and over again. But this isn't actually too difficult to achieve. It's simply a single movement of him rising up and having the frames reshuffled in order to create that struggle. Charizard lays on a fire spin. Notice as the flame moves around that the shading on Blastoise actually changes completely. It crossfades from one to another. This means that this portion of the animation was completely shaded twice, and the 2 layers were simply crossfaded from one to the other. That's really clever. And now we get to what the whole fight has been building up to, the final attack, the Fire Blast. If you're someone who grew up with this franchise, you may know what this attack looks like. This is how it was portrayed in the original show. It's quite impressive, but its movement is fairly soft, flowy. It's a single transitional movement from A to B. This is how it looks in Pokemon Origins.
Fire Blast, go!
This crazy 3-part movement makes it all the more powerful and just really makes you sit back in your chair and go, Let's take a closer look, starting from the cinematic technique of zooming out from Red's eye, then zooming out from Charizard's eye. That's nice, that's showing their symbolic connection and relationship with each other. But yes, all I want to see is this. Bang, bang, bang. We can see nearly everything we've looked at so far at play in this sequence. Small sketchy lines around his eyes, 3-tone shading. Zooming out from his eye once again, lots of line thickness variation on his face. As we zoom out, the light of the background is behind the character and is now backlit as well, a soft gradient emanating over the edge of his form. Look at his neck. The frames slow down, there's quite a bit of movement here, but notice between each drawing it becomes less and less, it eases down to 0 and is pretty much holding. That's more or less nothing. You know, the background is shifting further in the next frame. But now he comes forwards, the head twists, It is not a straight A to B movement. There is a path, there are waypoints, and there is extremities, squash and stretch, things exaggerated further than they would normally go for the sake of making it all the more cool. And seriously, look how much of the background's moving at this point. How do they get away with this? Dramatic movement here, right inside the mouth, and now we travel along with the fireball for several frames. In the span of just one image, we end up back here, which is reminiscent of this piece from the year 2000. The character zooms back into the distance really quickly, but the fireball stays the same size. We've traveled along with it for a time. It dissipates, it recollects itself the entire time. It is spinning counterclockwise before it bursts once, twice, rotates, sets itself in here. Look at how different, but how these images flow together from the state of the initial burst to its final form. Once it has formed, it's taking up the majority of the screen. At this point, everything stays still and the camera moves back once more. The first time the camera moved with the fireball, now it's moving back as the fire stays still. The fire begins a slow ease in this time, only over the course of about 3 drawings before it ends up moving quite fast, but it doesn't exit left of frame. We simply see Blastoise enter in through left of frame, but they don't quite get to touching yet. This allows them to move into the next shot, where we can get that last glint of I'm dead. Lastly, the final impact. It comes up, we get the first explosion. The camera is still moving, the second explosion. Shockwaves move out, the light, the darkness. The character is completely enveloped in light. The third explosion, high contrast, light one side, dark the other. Lots of white, blooming light before finally the fourth explosion. All of the white dissipates, the explosion is gone. We are now left with flames, the character visible once again. The flames dissipate, leaving us with mostly smoke. Animating smoke slowly disappearing is a pain in the ass, so cut away to a different character, who I thought was on about a 4-frame loop, but it's not a perfect loop at all. Several of the drawings are indeed reused, but they seem to be mixing it up. Like this one only appears twice, and this one appears 3 times. Come back after a bit, once again, the smoke filling the entire screen so every drawing can be completely different. After a whole lot of that, we get the silhouette of the character starts to form in, and the smoke dissipates from a close-up, which is still very time consuming, but not quite as much of a pain in the ass than having to do the entire thing. Good golly, I like that scene. And I hope you enjoyed exploring it with me. My name's Colin, and this has been Read Between the Frames, a new show here on the Onion Skin channel. So if you'd like to see more like it, go ahead and do that subscription thing. I also do a bunch of animation tutorials as well, so if you want to learn how to do this kind of thing, there may be even more fun to be had. So thanks for watching. I had a good time kind of just getting excited. So remember to have some fun, and I'll see you in the next one.